All right, here we go. So this is a little bit of a follow-up video to my previous video when I was talking about the Tournament of Champions and this week what happened in on the during the tour or during the event and during the show. Not too. I'm not going to get too deep into the show. I thought it was pretty good. You got to see some see the challenges of what these guys go through. You watch Belmo in that second match, and I thought he threw it pretty good and just really paid max penalty, for when the oil pushed down. Now, apparently, as I understand it, now this is the excuse that these guys are using, and it's all hearsay. But this whole thing, about the left side being locked out, this is it's just unacceptable. You just can't do that. You can't do that to these guys, and this is their career. So I just reading somewhere online that this was a very similar pattern to what they put out in last year's Tournament of Champions. However, they just used different oil, and apparently this oil pushed down faster than whatever oil they were using last year. Now, I know this is all hearsay, but if that's their excuse, yeah, that's not going to play well. I just don't think it is, and I don't know how there hasn't been more of I wouldn't call it uproar, but I just I'm kind of wondering why more hasn't been said about this. Because they had no chance. They shouldn't even showed up. I mean, that's how bad it was. And when you have that type of a lopsided result, from left to right, you just can't do that. If you flip it around, yeah, it's not really fair in a total pinfall type of environment. However, the Masters was unique, because it was, just basically get yourself into, uh, just get yourself into that top 63 or 64, depending on, if the winner of the previous year made it in or not. So, once you kind of get in there, then it's no longer total pinfall. So if the left side has a distinct advantage, yeah, in the Masters format, a lot of that could be negated. However, the left side is, was pretty nice, during the Masters. But anyways, I don't really want to talk about that event. I mean, what happens there happens, and it's happened quite often. Seems quite frequently at the Masters. Especially at the stadium. But anyways, we'll go on to the this year's Tournament of Champions. We saw a lot of lead changes, throughout match play. At one point Chris Vi was leading, looked like he was getting comfortable, looked like he was gonna, really take off with it. However, his I think it was last block of match play, or maybe a second block. I don't remember, but his last block he started off slow and just wasn't able to find it. And then Belmo, he was up there, he was leading, and then dropped off in the last block, and in his position round match, he shot 250 against Santu and was able to win that match, make it on the show. So here we are. So that first match against Bonta, I thought Belmo threw it pretty good. I thought they both pulled pretty well, and just Belmo happened to have more good shots. So, he won that match. And then going into his match with Andrew Anderson, that was just a typical situation, of oil pushing, and you think you're making, that you're making good shots, you're executing the shot, and the oil pushes on you, and Belmo, paid a max penalty, for that oil pushing on him. And that match was pretty much over after 5 or 6 frames. Then we get into the fun part. At least I thought it was fun because I did kind of predict this, as far as what the results were going to be, and it pretty much happened exactly how I thought it was going to happen. I think that I didn't come in and say it's like, oh, Alex is going to throw urethane. He's never going to go into resin or whatever. But I did think that, watching some of the, some of the videos on Alex Bowling, during match play, I really like the way he, just his overall lane presence, and it just felt like he was in control when I was watching some of those matches. And he got up, in that match against Andrew Anderson, and there was just no fear in him. I mean, that's the way he looked, very stoic out there, and so yeah, so it was fun to watch. And there's one key moment, that I felt, kind of going back through the match, this match against Andrew, where Alex really, to me, that this one shot is what won him the match. It was out of the commercial break. It was on the right lane, so he just missed on the right lane. Pretty sure. I got to go back, but anyways, but this was out of commercial break, and this is his first time on a PBA show, and so he comes out of the break, and he's he threw it pretty good, out of the break. So let me kind of play this a little bit for you guys. So let me get this teed up here. Thought I had this all ready for you guys. Let me see here. Yeah, I'm not doing too well here. There we go. There we go. All right. So finally got there. But yeah, so what you're going to see here, that this is Alex. This is just right out of the commercial break. So you're going to see him, get up here, and he's got a strike in the fifth on the left lane. Gets up, and what I didn't show here was his previous time on this lane. He went through the face, and so obviously, he had to make some type of, adjustment, or maybe just throw it better. It's kind of difficult for me to know if he threw it well when he went through the face, and maybe the ball checked on him or something like that. So it was difficult for me to see that. I really don't know his game that well. So, anyways, so his previous time on the right lane, he went through the face, out of the commercial break, which is a big deal because you're sitting there, your nerves are getting to you. Out of the commercial break, he basically converts the double, because he had a strike on the left lane, and we all know you need to string strikes in order to score. So, he comes up, in sixth frame, throws it good. It's a little bit of a light hit, but I think it was a good shot. I think it was a good thing for him to do. Coming out of the break, a lot of times you see guys, throwing it slow, just because, their adrenaline picks up, and then it kind of settles back down because the time it takes, for that commercial break. So, anyway, so got Taryn here interviewing Bone. So here, this is a big shot right here. This is going to convert a three bagger, and to me, right here, this is what won his first match, and this was critical. At this point, because now he's not only does he maintain his lead against Andrew, but he extends it and puts a lot of pressure on Andrew. So, anyways, let me switch this over. I'm going to go to what I thought was a key point here for well, anyways, I'm not going to go into a key point for Alex, because those of you that watched, you know um Alex went he went front four and then stoned an eight. I mean, he threw it great and just absolutely just stoned an eight, and he gets that hit, it's basically over. But anyways, Stone's an 8, and then he goes up in the left lane, and I thought he gassed it a bit. It was kind of like a half weak 10, that he left on the next on the left lane, after that Stone 8. So anyways, but I wanted to talk about Zach, and this is where I think Zach, you know, of course, hindsight, call it whatever you want, but Zach was the high qualifier, and he got to pick whatever lane he wanted to finish on. And it seemed like the right lane was more predictable for all of the guys, but it was playing faster. At least that's how the guys on the show were explaining it. Chris was on the show. Chris Barnes was commentating, alongside Kyle Sherman, and it seemed like the way they were seeing the lanes play, it was that the right lane was tighter, and tighter, but in a predictable way, where the left lane seemed to seemed to want to hook early, that it just had some check in it, and the guys that were trying to play in, they were fighting against it. So if you watched the first two matches, between Belmo and Brandon Bonta and Andrew Anderson, between those three, that they were kind of fighting that left lane a touch. So I can understand Zach's strategy was to come in and like, hey, I'm going to finish on the predictable lane. However, that didn't work out. We're going to see, this is his first shot on, his first shot on the right lane. So, this was not a good shot. He's had warm up. He's had, whatever time to kind of get prepared. Just won the previous week, and he's got to strike up, in the first frame, and this is his, this lane is his 10th frame lane, and he just made a terrible shot, and I'll show you.
Man has worked so diligently.
So I'm going to leave the audio off. I don't like the way the audio is, with my, with my mic setups here. So you go in here and just, pumps it through the face. To me, there's no excuse for that. He's had plenty of warm up. He knows what the lane is doing, and it just kind of pumps it through the face, So anyway, so we kind of get there, and I'm going to get to the next time. Let me see here. So here I'm showing you, this is the next time he's on that right lane. Now he just pumped it through the face, up against a strike, and he's got another strike, as far as on the left lane, and here he is, and just gasses it right through the break point, and it's like, yeah, I know it's easy for me to scrutinize after the fact. I just these are two mistakes on that right lane that basically essentially cost him the match, because at this point, Alex is lined up. Alex isn't missing. In fact, I don't think Alex missed until yeah, you can say, the miss spare, obviously miss spare didn't help, but that should have been a lot better shot than that bucket, but from here on out, this is where this is where Alex just was, I wouldn't say cruise control, because Alex did have a 245, or no, 258 in the eighth frame, and he chopped that also, just like Zach did. So anyways, kind of how how it played out, it was kind of what I was thinking. That's what I was describing in my previous video. Hopefully I'll remember to put a link down there somewhere in the description somewhere, so you can kind of watch that. But yeah, I thought that the second position was an enviable position, because presumably, you got 4 games plus all the warm up, on the championship pair. And so, what can happen, is that you get all that, you kind of get a majority of that transition, kind of out of the way, and then you can have a little bit more predictability. I'm not saying that they're easy or hard or any of that. I'm just saying that when you have a predictable transition, that's what we all want, right? We want to kind of have some level of understanding of how they're going to, how they're going to change. And usually when you get towards the end, or the later part of transition, that's where things start to stabilize. And I felt that, if Alex got out of that first game okay, what you did, and I thought that he was, he's going to be a handful, going up against Zach, and and he was, I mean, very easily, Alex could have had the front seven very, very easily, Stone 8 and 10 and a 10 pin, um, and Zach, it's unfortunate, because I was kind of thinking, if Zach could figure out this game and beat Alex, Zach to me would have been, front runner for Player of the Year. How fun would that have been? For him to win 2 titles in a row, one of them a major, and going into the last series of events, the World Series and the World Championship. Zach would have been, he would have been the front runner. So, and also Bonta, if he was able to run the ladder, if he was able to win that tournament, that probably would have just solidified Player of the Year. So I thought there were some pretty interesting storylines, going into the show here. And, congratulations to Alex Horton. What he did, was fun to watch. And I was a little fanboy standing off to the side, rooting him on. So anyways, that's about it for right now. I'm kind of playing around with some settings. If some of you have watched some of my previous videos, I'm kind of playing around with some settings here. I having some fun with this, and like I've said, in the past, I like talking bowling. So till next time, keep striking.